pleasant day to all of you,
Today we'll be tackling the chapter 12,
which entitled
East Asia Under the Challenges.
And now,
We will be the one who will lead you in this chapter.
my name is John Vincent Mendoza, and I'll be focusing on the problems that encounter in China.
So let me give you an overview. In this chapter, malalaman natin ang iba't ibang problemang panloob at panlabas na naranasan ng silangang Asya, partikular na ang bansang China at Japan. Malalaman din natin kung ano nga ba ang naging epekto nito sa kasalukuyang sitwasyon ng mga bansang ito. So let's start our topic in the looting of Summer Palace. Bilang parte ng Chinese society, gaano nga ba kahalaga ang lugar ng Summer Palace? Hindi lamang bilang tahanan ng kanilang emperor, kundi nagsisilbi rin itong manifestasyon at salamin ng kultura na mayroon ng China. Ito ay hitik sa mga mahalagang bagay na parte ng kasaysayan ng nasyong ito. Paano nga ba nagumpisa ang pagkakaroon ng interes ng mga dayuhang mananakop? Noong masilayan ng mga British at French ang loob ng Summer Palace, ay talagang nakita nila ang sistema na mayroon ng mga Chino. Bukod sa lahat ay naakit sila sa iba't ibang palamuti at mamahaling kagamitan na mayroon ito. At dahil dito ay kinuha nila ang mga ito at nagsimula ang pananakop nila dito. Pinangunahan nito ni Lord Elgin na kung saan a leader of the British forces in China, which soon restored order. After the Chinese took hostage and then murdered 20 British and French soldiers, however, Lord Elgin ordered the Summer Palace to be burned, na kung saan ito ay kinabahala ng mga Chinese, and soon they agreed to the Western demands. After ng pangyaring ito, gaano nga ba kahalaga ang naging epekto nito? So the events of 1800s were part of regular patterns in East Asia. In the 19th century, backed by European guns, European merchants and missionaries pressed for the right to carry out their activities in China and Japan. The Chinese and Japanese resisted but were eventually forced to open their doors to the foreigners. Unlike the Asian societies, however, both Japan and China were able to maintain their national independence. As part of Section 1, we'll be focusing on the decline of Qing Dynasty. So in 1800s, after a long period of peace and prosperity, the Qing Dynasty of the Manchus was at the height of its power. A little over a century later, however, humiliated and harassed by the Western powers, which is the Qing Dynasty, was collapsed. Nang dahil sa panloob at na problema ng Qing Dynasty, na unti-unting humina ang kanilang pwersa na kung saan marami sa kanila ang nagutom at namatay, at dahil dito unti-unting umabante ang mga Europeo. Dahil sa malawakang interes ng mga British sa China, nagpasok sila ng mga iba't ibang produkto. Unang-una na dito ay ang mga opyo, na kung saan isang halamang gamot na pag nasobra na ay maaring makalulong at makapag-promote ng adiksyon. Dahil sa walang habas na paggamit nito ay umalma ang Qing Dynasty na kung saan naglead ito sa pamamagitan ng Opium War. And the British refuses to halt their activity. However, as a result, the Chinese government blockaded the foreign area in Guangzhou. In order to pay traders to surrender their chests of opium, the British responded with force, starting the Opium War in 1839 to 1842. The Chinese were no match for the British. British warships destroyed Chinese coastal and river ports. When a British fleet sailed almost unopposed up the Qianjiang to Nanjing, the Qing Dynasty made peace. In the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, the Chinese agreed to open 5 coastal ports to British trade, limit taxes on import British goods, and pay for the cost of the war. China also agreed to give the British and the islands of Hong Kong. Nothing was said in the treaty about the opium trade. Moreover, in the 5 ports, the European lived in their own sections and were subject not to Chinese law, but to their own laws, a practice known as extraterritoriality, na kung saan mas lumawak pa ang kanilang teritoryo at may mga iba pang bansa na nagkaroon ng interes sa China. Next is the Taiping Rebellion. At dahil nabigo ang mga Chino sa Opium War, kinailangan pa rin nilang ipaglaban ang kanilang karapatan sa sarili nilang lupain, na kung saan sa pamamagitan nito ay nabuo ang Taiping Rebellion. In the meantime, the failure of the Chinese government to deal with pressing internal economic problems led to a peasant revolt known as Taiping Rebellion. It was led by Hong Xuan, a Christian convert who viewed himself as a younger brother of Jesus Christ. The Taiping Rebellion appealed to many people, but it called for a social reforms. These reforms including giving land to all peasants and treating women as equals of men. Women even served in their own units in the Taiping army. In March 1853, the rebels seized Nanjing, the second largest city of the empire, and massacred 25,000 men, women, and children. The revolt continued for 10 years but gradually began to fall apart. Europeans came to aid of the Qing dynasty when they realized the destructive nature of the Taiping forces. At dahil doon ay natapos ang revolt ng mga Taiping forces. The Taiping Rebellion appealed to many people because it called for social reforms. These reforms including giving land to all the peasants and treating women as equals of men. Women even served in their own units in the Taiping army. In March 1853, the rebels seized Nanjing, the second largest city of the empire, and massacred 25,000 men and women and children. The revolt continued for 10 more years but gradually began to fall apart. Europeans came to aid of the Qing dynasty when they realized the destructive nature of the Taiping forces, at dahil dito ay natapos ang revolt ng Taiping forces. Ngayon, dumako naman tayo sa iba't ibang hakbang na ginawa ng mga Chinese para maisulong nila ang reforma na kanilang hinahangad. Ang reformang ito ay tinawag nilang self-strengthening na naglalayong mas palakasin ang sistemang ekonomikal at politikal na nang sa gayon ay unti-unting lumakas at lalo pang umunlad ang kanilang bansa habang hindi sineset aside ang kanilang kultura at paniniwala, partikular na ang Confucian values and institutions. Some reformers wanted to change China's traditional political institutions by introducing democracy. However, such ideas were too radical for most reformers. During the last quarter of the 19th century, the Chinese government tried to modernize China military forces and build up industry without touching the basic elements of Chinese civilization. Railroads, weapons factories, and shipyards were built, but the Chinese value system remained unchanged. Sa pagpapatuloy ng ating talakayan, ngayon ay tatalakayin naman natin ang pag-abante ng mga imperialista. In the end, however, the changes did not help the king stay in power. The Europeans advanced into China and continued during the last 2 decades of the 19th century, while internal conditions continued to deteriorate. Sa pamamagitan ng sigalot na naranasan ng China, ay sinamantala ito ng mga Europeo, pero para mas mapalawak pa ang kanilang mga impluensya sa pamamagitan ng pagtatatag ng mga sphere of influence na naghati-hati sa bansang China sa ilalim ng Japan, France, Germany, Britain, and Russia. Sa pamamagitan ng mapang ito, mas maunawaan natin ang pag-iiral ng sphere of influence sa bansang China, na kung saan ito ay pinaghati-hatian ng mga bansang kanluranin, partikular na ang mga British, French, Germans, Russians, and including the Americans. So, sa kabila nito, ay nagpatuloy pa din ang panloob na krisis na kung saan ito ay nagsasaad in this latest scramble for territory took place at the time of internal crisis in China. In the spring of 1898, the young Emperor Guangxu launched a massive reform program based on the changes in Japan. With these reforms, the emperor intended to modernize government bureaucracy by following Western models, to adopt a new educational system that would replace the traditional civil service examination, to adopt Western-style schools, banks, and pre-press, and to train the military to use modern weapons and Western fighting techniques. Many conservatives at court, however, opposed these reforms. They saw little advantage in copying the West. As one said, an examination of the causes of success and failure in government reveals that the adoption of foreignism leads to disorder. According to this conservative, the traditional Chinese rules needed to be reformed and not just rejected in favor of Western changes. Isa sa mga tumutol ito ay si Empress Dowager Cixi. Empress Cixi became a dominant force at the court and imposed the emperor's reform. With the aid of imperial army, she eventually imprisoned the emperor and ended his reform efforts. She is one of the most important women in Chinese history. She ruled China for decades and brought a medieval empire into the modern age. She inaugurated women's liberation and embarked on a path to introduce parliamentary election to China. At para maiwasan ang labis na pagkapinsala ng China, pinayuhan ni US Secretary of the State John Hay na buksan ng China ang kanilang ekonomiya sa mga ibang nation na kung saan tutugon ito upang mapag-isa ang kanilang imperyo. Sa pamamagitan ng polisiyang ito ay hindi pa din nagwakas ang pakikialam sa iba't ibang dako ng teritoryo ng bansa ng mga Europeo. Bagkus mas naging maluwag ito para sa kapakanan ng mga Chinese. Nagpatuloy pa rin ang malawakang panloob na sigalot sa bansang China na kalaunan ay pinangunahan at pinagmulan ng Boxer Rebellion. So, Boxer was the popular name given to members of a secret organization called the Society of the Harmonious Peace. Members practice a system of exercise, a form of shadow boxing or boxing with an imaginary opponent that they thought would protect them from bullets. Additionally, the Boxers were upset by the foreign takeover of Chinese lands. Their slogan was to destroy the foreigner. They especially disliked Christian missionaries and Chinese converts to Christianity, who seemed to threaten the Chinese traditions. At the beginning of 1900s, Boxer bands roamed the countryside and slaughtered foreign missionaries and Chinese Christians. Nakalaunan ay naiuwi sa madugong labanan na ng Allied Army consisting of 20,000 British, French, Germany, Russian, American, and Japanese troops which attacked Beijing in August 1900s. The army restored order and demanded more concessions from the Chinese government. The Chinese government was forced to pay a heavy indemnity, which is a payment for damages to the power that had crashed because of the uprising. In 1905, a reformer named Sun Yat-sen presented a program that called for the following changes. Sa pagkakataong ito ay sinusulong ng sistema ni Dr. Sun Yat-sen ang pagkakaroon ng pantay na karapatan sa lahat ng tao ng lipunan. The president will be publicly chosen by the people of the country. The parliament will be made up of the members publicly chosen by the people of the country. May karapatan silang pumili ng pinuno na sa tingin nila ay makakatulong sa pagpapaunlad ng kanilang bansa. Equalized land ownership, which the good fortune of civilization is to be shared equally by all the people of the nation. We should assess the value of land in the country. Sa sitwasyong ito ay naglalayong matugunan ang pagkakaroon ng sistematikong pamamahala sa lupain sapagkat ito ang isa sa mga nagsisilbing pundasyon na nagmapanatili ng maayos at maunlad na ekonomiya ng isang bansa. Naglalayon din ito upang isulong ang produktibong pamamahala sa pamamagitan ng paglinang ng mga likas na yaman. Its present price shall be received by the owner, but all increase in the value resulting from reform and social improvements after the revolution shall belong to the state to be shared by all the people. And after the fall of Qing Dynasty, which is after the Boxer Rebellion, the Qing Dynasty in the China tried desperately to reform itself. Empress Dowager Cixi, who had long resisted her advisor's suggestion for change, now embraced a number of reforms in education, administration, and the legal system. Moreover, the recent reforms had done nothing for the peasants, artisans, and miners, whose living conditions were getting worse as taxes increases. Unrest grew in the countryside as the dynasty continued to ignore deep-seated resentments. So kung susumain natin, napakaganda ng layunin ni Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Pero teka, sino ba talaga siya? So tara mas kilalanin natin siya bilang isang reformista. So kabila ng bilang isang reformista, isa si Dr. Sun Yat-sen sa mga nagsusulong ng mga karapatan para sa kapakanan ng kanyang mga kababayan. Siya ay isang leader, revolutionary leader, na kung saan pinanganak sa Guangzhou. And he was educated in Hawaii. He returned to China to practice medicine but soon began to use his earnings to finance revolutionary activities. A failed revolution forced Sun to flee to Japan, and later, the United States and London there have raised money and recruited Chinese exiles to help carry out these revolutionary plans. So after the Qing government collapsed in 1911, he returned to China. Sun was never be fully realized his dreams of leading a new Chinese republic. Nevertheless, the government of both Republic of China on Taiwan and the Communist People Republic of China honor him as the founder of modern China. When the young radical Sun Yat-sen formed the revived China Society, Sun Yat-sen believes that the Qing dynasty was in a state of decay and could no longer govern the country. Unless the Chinese were united under a strong government, they would remain at the mercy of other countries. Although Sun believes that China should follow the patterns of Western countries, he also knew that the Chinese people were hardly ready for the democracy. Dahil sa hindi pa lubos na handa ang China sa demokrasya, unti-unting pinaintindi ni Sun Yat-sen ang sistemang ito na kung saan ito ay binubuo ng mga iba't ibang mga plano. So una, a military takeover. Sapagkat nagkaroon pa din ng kaguluhan sa iba't ibang nayon sa bansa, kinakailangan na pangunahan ito ng mga hukbong militar nang sa gayon ay unti-unting mapanatili ang peace and order sa kanilang bansa. Pangalawa, a transitional phase in which Sun's own revolutionary party would prepare the people for democratic rule. Pinag-aalala naman ay naglalayong magkaroon ng sistematikong paglipat na kung saan mas nagsisilbing gabay ito sa Chinese community upang mas lubos na maunawaan ang kanilang bagong sistema ng pamahalaan. And finally, the final stage of a constitutional democracy. At sa panghuli, kinakailangan ay ito ay anchored ng legal documents at base sa sistema na mayroon ng isang konstitusyon. Nang sa gayon ay mas mapagtibay ang iba't ibang polisiya at na ipairalin sa kanilang bansa. The Qing dynasty was near its end. In 1908, Empress Dowager Cixi died. Her nephew Guangxu, a prisoner in the palace, died one day before his aunt. The throne was now occupied by China's last emperor, the infant Henry Puyi. In October 1911, followers of Sun Yat-sen launched an uprising in central China. At that time, Sun was traveling in the United States. Thus, the revolt had no leader, but the government was too weak to react. The Qing dynasty collapsed, opening the way for the new political forces. So katapos ng mga ito, ay nagkaroon ng malaking era ng civil war. And after the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the military took over. Sun Yat-sen and his colleagues had accepted General Yuan Shiguai as president of the new Chinese Republic in 1911 because they lack of the military forces to compete with his control over the army. Many feared that if the revolt lapsed into chaos, the Western powers would intervene. If that happened, the last shreds of the Chinese independence would be lost. However, even the general new allies distrusted his motives. Yuan's dictatorial efforts rapidly led to clash with Sun's party, now renamed the Kuomintang or the Nationalist Party. When Yuan dissolves the new parliament, the Nationalists launched a rebellion. The rebellion failed and the Sun Yat-sen fled to Japan. Yuan was strong enough to brush off the challenge from the revolutionary forces, but he could not turn back history. He died in 1916 and was succeeded by one of his officers. For the next several years, China slipped into civil war as the power of the central government disintegrated, and the military warlords seized power in the provinces. Their soldiers caused massive destruction throughout China. Samantalang umiiral ang civil war sa bansang China, ay dumako naman tayo kay Wang Tao. Si Wang Tao ay isa sa mga inspirasyon ni Sun Yat-sen, na kung saan isinusulong niya ang reforma at demokratikong pamamahalaan. Isa sa mga sikat na quotes ni Wang Tao ay, "As the heaven is unified, the earth under the sky, it will harmonize the various teachings of the world and bring them back to the same sources." In his newspaper, while writing, he urged that the introduction of Western-style arsenals, shipyards, and mines He also was one of the first to warn the strengths of the West lay not merely in the superior military technology, but also in its democratic political system, which encouraged its superior technology to develop. He therefore called for the reform of the Chinese military, educational, administrative, and legal systems. At dahil sa mga kaganapang nangyari, ano nga ba ang naging epekto nito sa iba't ibang aspeto ng pamumuhay ng mga Chinese? The coming of the Westerners to China affected the Chinese economy in three ways. The Westerners introduced modern means of transportation and communication, na kung saan ito ang nagsilbing instrumento upang mas mapabilis ang kalakalan ng bansa. Pangalawa, they created an export market. Sa pamamagitan naman nito ay mas naiangat ang kanilang ekonomiya sa pagkakaroon ng malaking kita sa pagpapadala ng iba't ibang gawang produkto nila sa mga karating bansa. And they also integrated the Chinese market into the 19th century world economy. Ito naman ay isa sa mga napakalaking pagkakataon na sa ngayon ay napakalaking epekto upang maging isa sa mga pinakamasaganang ekonomiya ng bansa ang China, na kung saan maraming nagbukas para sa kanilang oportunidad na ikinaunlad ng kanilang nasyon. So ngayon, dumako naman tayo sa aspeto ng kabataan during this time, na kung saan nabigyan ng pagkakataon ng mga bata sa paglinang ng dekalidad na edukasyon, na kung saan mas mapapalawak ng kanilang kaalaman upang mas makatulong sa kanilang lupaing sinilangan. Nagpatayo ng iba't ibang institusyon pang edukasyon na magbibigay serbisyo sa mga bata upang mas matuto sa iba't ibang larangan at asignatura na kanilang pinili. So sa pananakop na naganap sa China, isa sa mga pinaka-naapektuhan din ang kanilang kultura, na kung saan in 1800s, daily life for the most Chinese was the same as it been for centuries. Most were farmers living in millions of villages, in rice fields, and on hillsides throughout the countryside. A farmer's life was governed by the harvest cycle, village custom, and family ritual. So makikita natin na ang simpleng pamumuhay ng mga Chinese ay nabago dahil sa pananakop ng mga kanluranin. Isa sa pagbabago ng aspetong kultural ay ang literatura, which influenced by foreign ideas and Western novels and short stories, began to attract a large audience. Although most of the Chinese novels written after World War I dealt with Chinese subjects, they reflected the Western tendency toward the realistic portrayal of society. Often they dealt with the new modernized middle class. Mao Zedong's Midnight, for example, describes the changing customs at ipinotortray nila yung mga pagbabagong naganap sa pamamagitan ng sistema ng pagsusulat. So ito ay nagsilbi rin na isang napakalaking epekto upang mabago ang kanilang kasaysayan, partikular na ang kanilang pamumuhay at kultura. Ngayon, atin nang nasilayan ng mga problemang naranasan ng China sa ilalim ng mga kanluranin, na talaga lamang nakakamangha na sa kabila ng mga napakaraming suliranin na kanilang naranasan ay pinakita ng China bilang isang Asyano na unti-unti ay makakabangon sila tungo sa pag-unlad at pag-angat sa iba't ibang aspeto ng pamumuhay na parte ng kanilang napakayaman na kasaysayan. At ngayon dumako naman tayo sa bansang Japan na i-discuss at tatalakayin sa inyo ni Miss Joanna Rivera.
My name is Joanna Marie R. Rivera from Social Studies 3A, and my topic is all about the rise of the modern Japan. Sa pagpatuloy natin ay dumako naman tayo sa bansang Japan bilang isang pausbong na modernong bansa. Dito natin malalaman ng mga ginawang hakbang ng mga Hapon upang palakasin ang kanilang hukbo bilang pagpapatuloy na isang mamamayagpag hanggang sa kasalukuyan. By 1800, the Tokugawa shogunate had ruled the Japanese islands for 200 years. It had driven out foreign traders and missionaries and isolated the country from virtually all contact with outside world. The Tokugawa maintained a formal relations only with Korea. So in this section, you will learn how the Treaty of Tokugawa brought Japan out of isolation and started its development into an imperialist nation. Sa huling akbang para sa diplomatikong pagpapanumbalik nga, ipinabatid ng panig ng Korea ang Japan na kailangan magpadala muna ng liham ni Ieyasu. Ieyasu na siya ang pinakamataas or nagbibigay ng kasulatan sa Korea na nagpapahayag ng paghingi ng tawad para sa giyera. Nagpadala ng isang formal na letter na unang pinahiwatig ang pagpapasakop ng ibang partido alinsunod sa diplomatiko o proteksyon o bilang protocol sa oras na iyon. So, tinanggi or hindi pumayag si Ieyasu sa letter na hinihingi ng Korea, kaya't gumawa si Yoshitoshi na pikein na lang ang isang sulat or yung sulat na may selyo ni Ieyasu. First foreign power to succeed with Japan was the United States. In the summer of 1853, an American fleet of 4 warships under Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay, which is now Tokyo Bay. They sought, as Perry said, to bring a singular and isolated people in the family of civilized nations. Perry, accompanied by an even larger fleet, returned to Japan for an answer. Shogunate officials had been discussing the issue. Some argued that the contacts with the West could hurt Japan. Others pointed to the military superiority of the United States and recommended concessions or political compromises. The question was ultimately decided by the guns of Commodore Perry ships. Maaaring magtagumpay ng walang pagdanak ng dugo, ngunit napagpasyahan ni Perry na dahil ang mga Hapon ay mapanlinlang at mapaghiganti na sa tauhan, ang mga patakaran ng diplomasya sa sibilisadong bansa ay hindi mailalapat, habang ang mga otoridad ng shogunal ay nagpasya sa isang sagot sa kanyang hinihiling. Si Perry at ang kanyang mga barko ay parang nagsagawa ng isang malalim na tunog at pagsukat ng bilang pagsalungat sa kahilingan nga ng Hapon na itigil ang mga naturang aktibidad. Under military pressure, Japan agreed to the Treaty of Kanagawa. This treaty between Japan and the United States provided for the return of shipwrecked American sailors, the opening of 2 ports to Western traders, and the establishment of a U.S. consulate in Japan in 1858. U.S. Consul Townsend Harris signed a more detailed treaty. It called for the opening of several new ports to U.S. trades and residences, as well as the exchange of ministers. Similar treaties were soon signed by Japan and several European nations. So dito sinasabi na yung kasunduan sa Kanagawa, isang kasunduan noong 1854 sa pagitan nga ng Estados Unidos ng Amerika at ng gobyerno ng Japan. So sa tinaguriang pagbubukas ng Japan ng dalawang bansa ay sumang-ayon na magsali ang limitadong kalakalan at sumang-ayon sa ligtas na pagbabalik ng mga Amerikanong marino na nasira sa barko ng Japan. Resistance to the new order. The decision to open relations with the Western powers was highly unpopular in parts of Japan. Resistance was especially strong among the samurai warriors in 2 territories in the south, Satsuma and Koshu. Both had strong military traditions and neither had been exposed to heavy Western military pressure. During the 1863, the Sacho alliance from Satsuma Koshu forced the shogun to promise to end relations with the West. So matapos mabuo ng Treaty of Kaganawa, madami pa din ang maalma. So the rebellious groups soon showed their own weakness. However, when Soshu troops fired on Western ships in the Strait of Shimonoseki, which leads into the Sea of Japan, the Westerners fired back and destroyed the Koshu fortifications. The incidents convinced the rebellious forces of the need to strengthen their military. So gumawa sila ng mga paraan para mapalakas palalo ang kanilang militar. They also became more determined not to give in to the West. As a result, such leaders urged the shogun to take stronger position against the foreigners. Sa pagkakataong ito, the Sacho leaders demanded that the shogun resign and restore the power of the emperor. In January 1868, their armies attacked the shogun's palace in Kyoto and proclaimed that the authority of the emperor had been restored. After a few weeks, the shogun's forces collapsed, ending the shogunate system. So ayun nga, matapos ang masalimuot na pagkikipag-api ng mga shoguns, kinakailangan ang pagkakaroon ng makabagong aksyon sa pamamahala ng nang sa gayon ay mapanatili nila ang kanilang pamahalaan at dito nagsimula ang Meiji Restoration which is the new leaders embark on the policy of reform that transformed Japan into a modern industrial nation. Now, let's move to the Meiji Restoration. The Sacho leaders had genuinely mistrusted the West, but they soon realized that Japan must change to survive. The new leaders embarked on the policy of reform that transformed Japan into a modern industrial nation. The symbol of the new era was the young emperor, Mutsuhito. He called his reign as Meiji, or Enlightened Rule. This period has thus become known as the Meiji Restoration. In Japanese history, the political revolution during the 1868 that brought about the final demise of the Tokugawa shogunate or the military government, thus ending the Edo or yung Tokugawa period, and at least nominally returned control of the country to direct imperial rule under Mutsuhito or the Emperor of Meiji. Sa isang malawak na konteksto, gayunpaman ang muling pagpapanumbalik ng Meiji noong 1868 ay nakilala sa kasunod na panahon ng pangunahing pagbabago ng pampolitika, pang-ekonomiya at panlipunan. Ang panahon ng Meiji ay nagdulot ng paggawa ng makabagong westernisasyon ng bansa. The restoration event itself consisted coup d'etat in the ancient imperial capital of Kyoto on January 3, 1868. The perpetrators announced the ousters of Tokugawa Yoshinobu, or the last shogun, who by late 1867, if I'm not mistaken, was no longer effectively in power, and proclaimed the young emperor to be the ruler of Japan. Yoshinobu mounted a brief civil war that ended with his surrender to imperial forces in June during the 1869. So dito ang mga reforma sa Meiji ay nagdala ng malalaking pagbabago sa kapwa loob ng Japan at sa lugar ng Japan sa mga gawain ng daigdig. Dito sapat na pinalakas ng Japan ang kanyang sarili upang manatiling isang soberenyang bansa sa harap ng mga kapangyarihan ng kolonya ng kanluranin at sa katunayan ay naging isang kapangyarihan ng kolonya. So, sa transformation of Japanese politics, habang nagpapatuloy ang reforma na mayroon sa Meiji period, kinakailangan na magkaroon ng malawakang transformasyon sa iba't ibang larangan na kung saan ang mga new leaders move first to the abolish of old order and to strengthen power in their hands, to undercut the power of daimyo. The local nobles, the new leaders, stripped these great lords of the littles to their lands in 1871. As compensation, the lords who were given government bonds and were named governors of the territories formerly under their control. The territories were now called prefectures. So dito, kumbaga, ang Meiji Constitution ay nagkaroon ng iba't ibang pagbabago na hango sa kanluring kaisipan. They adopted in 1889 was modeled after the Imperial Germany. Most authority was given executive branch. Meiji Constitution adopted in 1889 was modeled after the Imperial Germany authority was given an executive branch. So, ang Constitution ng Meiji noong 1889 na natili sa Constitution ng Japan hanggang sa 1947 pagkatapos ng World War II ay higit na isinulat ni Ito Hirobumi at lumikha ng isang parlamento o na may isang mababang kapulungan na inihalal ng mga tao at isang punong ministro at gabinete na hinirang ang emperador. Kapayapaan at yung katatagan ng panahon ng Tokugawa at ang pagpapaunlad ng pang-ekonomiya ay tinaguyod nito. Ang nagtakda ng yugto para mabilis na paggawa ng makabago na naganap pagkatapos ng major restoration sa panahon ng Meiji na nagtapos ang pagkamatay ng emperador noong 1912. Naranasan ng bansa ang makabuluhang pagbabago sa lipunan, pampolitika at pang-ekonomiya kasama na ang pagwawaksi ng sistemang feudal or yung feudal system at ang pag-aampon ng isang sistemang gabinete ng gobyerno. In addition, binuksan din muli ang bagong rehimen ng bansa sa kalakal at impluensyang kanluranin at pinangasiwaan ng isang pagbuo ng lakas militar na malapit ng magtulak sa Japan sa entablado ng mundo. Next, the Meiji economics. The Meiji leaders also set up a new system of land ownership. A land reform program made the traditional lands of daimyo into a private property of the peasants. The daimyo, as mentioned, were compensated with the government bonds. Kapag sinabi kasing daimyo, ito yung sila yung malalaking nagmamay-ari ng lupa at mga basalyo ng shogun. Ang bawat daimyo ay kumuha ng isang ukbo ng samurai or mandirigma upang maprotektahan ang buhay at pag-aari ng kanilang pamilya. So, one of the best benefits of being a daimyo is the fact that you only serve one group of people and no one else. Wala ka na ibang protektahan kundi ang pamilya mo lamang. And another is that you own massive portions of land and are very wealthy. You are almost always protected by the samurai, and lastly, you earn taxes and you have large amounts of political power. And according to my research, yung pinakalas na naging samurai daimyo sa Japan ay si Saigo Takamori, or yung kilala siya bilang Takanaga, na kung saan was one of the most influential samurai in Japanese history and one of the 3 great nobles who led the Meiji Restoration. Living during the late Edo and the early Meiji period, he has been dubbed as the last true samurai. On the other hand, a unique feature of Meiji model of industrial development was the close relationship between government and private business. The government encouraged the development of new industries by providing business people money and privileges once an individual enterprise or industry was on its feet. It was turned over entirely to private ownership. Even then, however, the government continued to place some rules in the industry activities. So siguro sa panahon ay sa pagkakataon na ito ay umiral na yung capitalism na mayroong pagbagay sa pamahalaan. Sa sistemang ito ay nagkaroon ng bawat isa na umunlad upang makatulong sa pambansang progreso tungo sa modernong Japan. At syempre, ang paglago ng sektor ng pang-agrikultura ng ekonomiya ay nakatulong posible na ang paglago ng pagmamanufaktura ng Japan na binabayaran ng mga magsasaka ang buwis na lumilikha ng kita na gamit ng gobyerno para sa pamumuhunan sa pag-unlad ng pang-industriya. Ang gobyerno ng Japan at ang mga industrialista nito, ang Zaibatsu, ang gumabay sa bansa sa ekonomiya. Ang Japan ay umunlad ang mga industriya sa isang mabilis na takbo, higit sa lahat dahil nais ng gobyerno na gawing isang makabuluhang lakas na militar ang Japan. Kasama sa slogan na mayamang bansa, malakas na hukbo. Nagsimula ang paggawa ng barko. Hinimok ng gobyerno ng Japan ang pagbuo ng mga riles ng tren, pagbuo ng buong bansa, at hinimok ang paglikha ng isang telegraph networks na kung saan ang mga linya ng pagpapadala. At isa pang modernong sistema ng pagbabangko ay ang binuo. Ang industriya ng tela at sutla ay mabilis na lumawak. Kaya kung makikita natin na yung sa picture, parang yung ekonomiya ng Japan ay unti-unting lumalawak dahil sa kanilang mga ekonomiyang ginagamit at kanilang mga business na inopen during this time. The Hitokiri Batausai. So sa kwentong ito ipinakita ang epekto ng Meiji regime para unti-unting may taas ang Japan tungo sa malawakang pag-unlad nga. So ito yung nagsilbing susi para mas mapalawig yung kapangyarihan ng Japan sa kabila ng hirap na naranasan nito sa kamay nga ng mga mananakop. And for your information also, Hitokiri is a Japanese samurai film na kung saan isa siyang set during the end of Tokugawa shogunate and based on the lives of historical for Hitokiri of Bakumatsu. So it is a notable for starring the famous author Yukoi Mishima. So si Kenshin Himura isang katangisip na tauhan at tiyak na walang pulang ulo na nakaraan ay nakikitang X mark sa kanyang pisngi. So, kung makikita nyo meron siyang X mark sa kanyang pisngi na gumala at kalaunan ay pinagtibay ng isang doho. Gayunpaman, ang karakter na si Hitokiri or kilala bilang Kenshin ay sinasabing batay sa pagkakakinanlan ni Kawakami Gensai. So next, building a modern social structure na kung saan magsisimula sa ibaba ang merchants, artisans, peasants, ronin, samurai, daimyo, shogun, and yung emperor na siyang pinakamataas. So, kinakailan din ng Japan na gawing moderno ang sistema ng kanilang pamumuhay at pamamahala sa pamamagitan ng pagtatatag ng makabagong struktura na sama-samang maglilinang upang mapaunlad ang kanilang bansa. So, pagdating naman sa karapatan ng mga kababahian ay mayroong social beliefs na ang babaeng Japanese ay mayroon siyang 3 obedience: child to father, wife to husband, and widow to son. Pero kalaunan ay napalitan nito sapagkat nagkaroon ng pagbabago at nabigyan na pagkakataon na makapag-aral ang mga kababahian at magkaroon ng trabaho na hindi nalilimitahan. So now, let's move to the impact of Meiji Restoration na kung saan ngayon ay pag-isahin natin kung ano nga ba ang naging epekto ng Meiji period sa Japan na kung saan ang unang-una ay nagkaroon ng matibay na imperyo na ang sentro nito ay ang bayan ng Edo na nagkaroon din ng pagbabago sa aspetong politikal na nagbigay ng pinuno ng mas malawak na saklaw ng kapangyarihan. Samantalang pagdating naman sa ekonomiya ng daimyo, ang nagsilbing gabay sa sistema ng mga lupain at ang bansa ay mas naging industrialisado dahil sa mga kagamitang makabago na ginamit sa produksyon, sa pagbibigay ng serbisyo, habang ang aspetong sosyal at estruktura mas pinalakas ang hukbong sandatahan upang mapanatili ang seguridad ng buong imperyo. So dito nagkaroon din ng pagbabago at pag-unlad sa paglinang ng edukasyon na kung saan madami ang namulat at natuto sa iba't ibang larangan na pinili nila. So madami din ng mga makakanluraning nakagawian na kanilang ginamit upang mapaunlad ang kanilang pamumuhay. So dahil sa pagpapatuloy nga ng pag-unlad ng bansang Japan, nagkaroon sila ng unti-unting interes sa mga karatig bansa upang mas mapalawak ang kanilang imperyo. Sila ay gumamit ng mga kanluraning taktika o yung mga tactics na ginagamit sa mga kanluran upang sa gayon ay mas maging malakas ang kanilang hukbo. To some Japanese, the lessons of history were clear. Western nations had amazed of their wealth and power not only because of their democratic, economic, and educational system, but also because of their colonies. So the beginning of expansion. The Japanese began their program of territorial expansion close to home. During the 1874, Japan claimed control of the Ryukyu Islands, which had long been subject to the Chinese Empire. 2 years later, Japan's Navy forced the Koreans to open their ports to Japanese trade. Kung sisiyasatin natin itong mapa na kung saan masasaksihan natin na ang lumawak ang kolonya ng Japan sa iba't ibang parte ng Asya. Nagsimula noong 1870 nang mapag-isa nito ang buong bansa at paglipas ng 1910 ay nasakop nito ang Korea at ibang pang parte ng China. At noong 1910 then ay mas dumami pa tulad ng iba't ibang parte ng China at nagkaroon din ito ng interes sa Pilipinas. Nakalaunan ay nasakop niya ang kasagsagan ng World War II. So dito, ang pananakop din ng mga Hapones sa Asya at ang kampanya ng Pasipiko na sumunod ay una ng napakalaking tagumpay. Paulit-ulit na minamaliit ng mga kaaway nito at madalas ay may maraming bilang. Ang disiplinadong sanay na pwersa ng Hapon na talunin ng mga pwersang Amerikano, British, Australia at Dutch, pati na din ang kanilang mga lokal na kaalyado. So, ang napakalawak na pagpapalawak nga ng teritoryo ng mga Hapon ay naging malawak pa sa inaakala nilang mas magiging lalawak ito. 6 na buwan matapos ang Pearl Harbor, ang imperyo ng Hapon ay umabot mula sa Manchuria sa hilaga patungo sa Owen Stanley Range na nakasuot ng kagubatan sa New Guinea sa timog. Sa kanluran ng imperyo ay nagsimula sa hangganan ng Assam ng India at nagpatuloy sa Gilbert Island sa Timog Pasipiko. Pinagtalo pa ng Hapon ang pangkalahatang tauhan ng Hapon kung sasalakayin nila ang Australia kahit na ang mabibigat na pangako ng militar sa Tsina ay naayos sa planong ito. Bahagya lamang may lakas ang Tokyo upang ipagtanggol ang teritoryo na nakuha na nito. So dahil nga doon sa resultang diskarte sa giyera ng Hapon ay nakasalalay sa napakalaking paunang paghampas ng sorpresa ng mga Allied fleet at Air Force daungan o sa mga mahina na airstrikes. So pagkatapos na ay may paikita ng mga Hapon ang isang mabibigat at magastos na linya ng pagtatanggol ng mga pasilyo at tanggapan nila ang mga nakamit ng Japan at naghabol para sa kapayapaan nito. So now, let's move to the Japanese expansion. So, war against Russia. In 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian naval base at Port Arthur, which Russia had taken from China in 1898 rather. When Japanese forces moved into Manchuria and Liaodong Peninsula, Russian troops proved to be no match for them. So dahil dito ay parang pinatunayan ng Japan ang kanyang lakas at tinuring bilang one of the most powerful countries in the world. So in the meantime, Russia had sent its Baltic fleet halfway around the world to East Asia only to be defeated by the new Japanese Navy off the coast of Japan. After their defeat, the Russians agreed to a humiliating peace in 1905. They gave the Liaodong Peninsula back Japan as well as the southern part of Sakhalin, an island north of Japan. So during this the time the US and Japan make a relations, during the next few years Japan consolidated its position in the northeastern Asia. It established a sphere of influence in Korea, which Vincent explained a while ago. In 1905, the United States recognized Japan's role in Korea in return for Japanese recognition of American authority in the Philippines. During the 1910, Japan annexed Korea outright. So, bilang parte ng pagunlad ng mayroong napakalaking relasyon ng Japan at United States, and during dito din nagkaroon ng parang pagkakasundo ni President Theodore Roosevelt, made a gentleman's agreement with Japan that essentially stopped Japanese immigration to United States. So next, the culture in an era of transition. The wave of Western technology and ideas that entered Japan in the last half of the 19th century greatly altered the shape of traditional Japanese culture. Literature was especially affected. So the novels showed the greatest degree of change. People began to write novels that were patterned after the French tradition of realism. Naturalist Japanese authors tried to present existing social conditions and the realities of war as objectively as possible. So, dito natuto yung mga tao na magsulat ng kanilang mga novels, and makikita natin as of now na napakarami ng pwedeng basahin na novel in this era. Also, the other aspect of Japanese culture were also changed. The Japanese invited technicians, engineers, architects, and artists from Europe and the United States to teach their modern skills to eager Japanese students. The Japanese copied Western artistic techniques and styles. Huge buildings of steel and reinforced concrete adorned with Greek columns appeared in many Japanese sites. Also, in addition to this, the cultural exchange also went the other way. Japanese arts and crafts, porcelains, textiles, fans, folding screens, and wood block prints became fashionable in Europe and North America. Japanese art influence. So ngayon, atin na nasaksihan ng mga hamon na kinakaharap ng East Asia, lalong-lalo na ang bansang China at Japan. At sa kabila nito ay unti-unti nating naunawaan kung paano nila ito nalagpasan upang maging maunlad na bansa sa kasalukuyan. Kaakibat ng kanilang kultura at paniniwala bilang mga Asyano ay pinanatili nila na kailanman na hindi pasisiil sa kabila ng patong-patong na suliranin na daladala ng mga kanluranin.
Ang rehiyon ng Silang Asya ay isa sa maunlad na lugar. Parte ng Asya, kulturang Asyano. Sa tuwing masisilayan, rehiyon ng Silang Asya. Bansang China, Korea, Japan at Taiwan. Humarap sa mga problema at unti-unting sinuong upang kanyang makamtan ang kanyang kasarilan. Sa tuwing sasapit ang mga sigalot, panloob at panlabas na dala-dala nito. Labis na kaguluhan ang kanyang naranasan sa ilalim ng mga Europeo bilang mananakit.